What is up guys, Blue Spooky here with the Wednesday 2-hour Megamix. That is 2 hours of new true scary stories to this channel, as much as I'm able to track. If you guys enjoy this long video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing all of those ensures I can keep making daily videos for a long time to come, especially these longer ones. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about doing this is reading your guys' comments, even if I don't always get the chance to reply to them. Without further ado though guys, I will let you enjoy the next 2 hours of true scary stories, and I will see you again at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. When I was in high school and I first began driving, I began doing deliveries for my father's business. We lived in town and most of the deliveries would be in town as well. However, there were definitely some orders that required me to drive out into the more rural areas around there. This was around 40 years ago, so it was long before people were ordering things online every day. In order to get some things, my dad would have to order them for his customers and then have them either picked up or delivered. They were mostly mechanical parts and computer parts, which were a little bit more difficult to get back then than they are now. Around the time that I had been doing this for just over a year, I began having some issues with a group of guys in school. They would give me a hard time because I had my dad's car to drive around in and would never give them rides in it. My dad had forbidden that, and he was the kind of guy who would be quite scary when he was pissed off about something. Because I denied them though, they started being real jerks to me, especially after they'd asked multiple times and I had to turn them down each one. I started looking forward to working more often in my free time. I wasn't dating much or at all, so I really enjoyed the time I had to myself driving. One of the strangest orders was for a computer part. I had gotten it with a phone number and no address on it. I had to call and ask for the delivery address when the part came in. It turned out this guy lived really far out in the hills and had to give me some very elaborate directions to get to his place. I was surprised by just how far out it was. It was a bit late once it arrived and it was so far out. It was getting dark, so I offered to bring the part by the next day instead. He offered me a really good tip to get it to him that night, something I just couldn't turn down. It was already getting dark as I was heading out, and I wasn't used to driving at nighttime. I also didn't drive out into these hills very often, so this was a very new experience for me. I didn't like driving at night around here. It was so hard to see where you were going. I would occasionally fear things jumping out of the dark at me. I was pretty worried about getting lost out there. The roads were very thin and easy to lose track of. I was surprised by the time I got to the house. I got out with a flashlight and made sure the letters on the old mailbox were the correct ones. There were no lights on at the house inside or out, and the place looked like it was abandoned. I was worried I had somehow gotten it wrong, but the numbers I'd been given were correct. If there had been a driveway leading up to this house, it had long since grown over. Rather than drive right up to it, I had to walk a fair distance. I grabbed the part and the flashlight and began to walk up to this dark and scary home. I was walking slowly up to the house. Part of this was because it was so dark and hard to see, but also because I wanted to put it off as long as possible. A large part of me wanted to just leave the part in the yard and not walk up at all. Of course, then I wouldn't get the tip the guy had promised me. That was the only thing that kept me moving forward. About halfway up the front yard, I did notice a light turn on in the home. At first, I felt some sense of relief, but that went away when the front door opened, and a dark figure emerged onto the porch. I could only see the figure because of the light on behind him, clearly holding some sort of rifle in his hands. I didn't feel very welcome. For a few moments, neither of us moved. I took another step forward, but no sooner than that, I noticed him pointing the rifle right at me. I strongly suspected this was not the same person I had talked to on the phone just shortly before. I didn't know how to react. The only thing I wanted to do was run back to the car. I was on shaky legs, however, and felt unable to do that. It didn't take but a moment for the man to begin yelling gibberish at me. I really didn't understand anything he was saying. It was all just jumbled and scary sounding. At that point, I dropped the part on the ground and just ran back to the car as quickly as I could. I kept expecting to get shot in the back on the way out. Fortunately, no shots came. I got back to the car. The man had walked off his porch and out into the yard, but it didn't seem he was pursuing me really. I was able to drive off and out of there. I was still shaken pretty badly. The whole ride until I got home was terrifying. When I did arrive, I explained everything to my dad about what happened. I'm not sure how much he believed me at first, but he accepted that I was telling the truth eventually. There is a little more to the end of this story. I found out much later what might have happened in this case. A former friend of mine, one who had gotten pissed at one of the other guys who were bullying me, told me that it was a setup to get me shot. They had ordered the computer part and given me the wrong address to deliver it to. The owner of the house was one of these guys' great uncles or something, and he hated whenever anyone came onto his property. The bullies knew that at the very least the old man would scare me, but also he would likely shoot at me. I never confronted them on it. I knew the guy who told me would deny it if I told them that he'd said it, so I never found out if that's really what happened. However, it did make a lot of sense. I had always grown up in an urban and suburban environment. I liked it and always felt I would remain in such an environment. There was a short period in my life, however, when I got really fascinated with the idea of being out in the country or camping, just communing with nature in one way or another. I have some Native American roots, and I think that although I hadn't paid much mind to them growing up, they eventually became more interesting to me, and thus I became more interested in exploring nature as a result. I should probably point out that I know not all Native Americans are interested in nature or anything like that. It was a pretty uneducated belief. Around that time, people always equated being Native American with nature and spiritualism. I got myself really deeply believing in things like that. I was not experienced with nature or camping or anything like that, but I wanted to go out and try it and see what it was like. A cousin of mine was also into this sort of thing, so we set up a time that the two of us could maybe try and go camping. The weather was supposed to be absolutely beautiful for a week. That was when we decided to go out and camp. He thought it would be a good idea to try and camp without tents, but I wasn't quite ready for that yet. My cousin was probably pretty happy that I did bring one, though. The camping trip did not turn out anything like we thought it would. Immediately, we could sense that we were not alone in those woods. My cousin's dad owned the land for miles and miles, so no one was supposed to be on it. There were tons of things that led us to believe that someone else was out there with us. We heard a bunch of things, and none of them were very pleasant sounding. I wish I could describe them to you, but other than the sounds of footsteps and breaking sticks, all the other stuff was so weird that I don't know how to word it. It was like there was some person making strange noises with their mouth to try and scare us, because they were definitely not sounds that animals make. Some of the things I could have written up to our imaginations. We were trying to have a fun time, and maybe we were looking for things that may not have been there. It began to get too weird for that pretty quickly, though. On the second day during the afternoon hours, we were shocked when the sky started getting darker. Dark and violent storm clouds began moving in. These were not forecasted to happen. The wind picked up and the lightning and thunder began shrieking and booming in the sky. Because of the sheer speed of the storm that was rolling in, very, very fast, we had to struggle to put up the tent. My cousin had slept outside the previous night and had neglected to bring his own tent, but I would let him stay in mine for the duration of the storm. Because of just how fast and hard the wind was blowing, it was difficult to try and get everything set up. We did the best we could. Fortunately, there was a lot of build-up for the storm before the rain actually started hitting, so we got into the tent a good time before that. The storm was a real violent one. It was scary being out in it. The wind was slapping up against the tent, and many times we thought it would be ripped out from the ground. Somehow it held up throughout. Unfortunately, the tent staying on the ground was the least of our concerns. It was dark outside the tent, even though it was still daytime. During some of the lightning strikes, my cousin began to get very paranoid. He thought he had seen someone outside the tent. He kept trying to look through the tent flap windows to see if he could get a better look at what was going on. It was just too hard to see out there in all that darkness. At one point, though, I guess he happened to be looking out when a bolt of lightning lit up the entire outside of the countryside. My cousin yelped out in fear as he must have seen something. He told me that there was someone out there in the rain, standing and watching us, a big guy that he had only seen for a moment, but he had seen them very clearly. I pushed him away and looked out the window as well, but I didn't see anyone out there, not even when the lightning flashed again. Not long after my cousin had seen the person, though, something pulled one of the stakes of the tent out of the ground, and that part collapsed. I was worried, but most of the tent was still up, so I thought everything would be fine. Whoever was outside pulling them pulled up the others, and suddenly the entire tent collapsed onto the two of us. My cousin kept yelling that someone was out there, pulling the stakes up. He was terrified and wanted to get out and run. I couldn't stop my cousin. He was able to slip out of the tent, and I did too. Suddenly, I no longer wanted to be there myself either. We both began running through the violent storm, doing our best to get back as fast as possible. That was the only thing on both of our minds. Turning around, another bolt of lightning flashed. I was looking back in that moment, and there was absolutely someone there, standing by the camping area. It was hard to get a good look at him in that brief moment, but he had definitely torn down our tent. We came back later in the week when it was dry, and went looking for our stuff. When we found it, it had all been slashed up. It was definitely done by a person. We were with my uncle, who owned the land and was pissed off as hell that someone had done this on his property, but he was never able to find out who it was or do anything about it. This happened to me when I was going on a hike a few days through a park. I don't want to say where it happened exactly, because I'm still not really sure what exactly happened, and I don't want to speak badly about a place if I can't know exactly what was going on there. I went hiking all on my own. It was a specific hiking trail, and it was not unusual to run into other hikers all the time. I was doing this during a time when I had some time off. I had deliberately picked this time because I was less likely to run into others. I like sticking to the official trails because they were safer, and I was less likely to get lost, so I tended to do all my hiking when others wouldn't be. I must have really picked a good hiking time this time, because I wasn't encountering a single other person at all. Starting that first evening out there, though, I began experiencing things that made me feel like I wasn't alone. The first was sounds of other people walking. The first few times I heard it, when I looked around or waited to give the person time to catch up to me, I never did see anybody. What's more, the sounds would stop shortly after I quit walking. I wasn't too scared at first, though. It was just kind of strange, really. There were no more noises or anything at night on that first night. Although I couldn't explain it, I no longer had the feeling of being watched or not being alone. By that point, I decided it was all in my imagination. I was in my tent and had a peaceful sleep that first night out. Those feelings didn't last too long, however. The following day, things started out much the same, but it got even stranger. A few times I could have sworn I saw someone when I heard the noises stop, but whoever it may have been, they tried to stay far out of the range of my sight. I could barely tell if I was actually seeing someone there, or if it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. It was very disconcerting, and it really just amplified the feeling of being watched and the fear that came from it. Things got a little weirder that night. At first, I thought it may have just been me being worked up from the whole day. Fear has a tendency to do that. You can work yourself up over time and your mind can begin playing tricks on you. That unpleasant feeling of being watched only got worse as it got darker outside, and even worse at night while I was trying to go to sleep. Things didn't get better the next day either. Although I was able to get some sleep, I didn't end up sleeping very well. I wasn't feeling great and felt myself becoming a lot more paranoid. Once again, I thought I was catching a glimpse of something keeping out of my field of view. Almost like someone knew I was having a difficult time believing I was alone in the woods and was preying upon those thoughts. The third evening was when I really began to get a little worried. I actually heard something that I couldn't just describe away. While I was trying to get rest in my tent this night, I heard what was undeniably another human being whistling outside in the dark. What made it worse was that it would occasionally stop, and then when it started back up again, it would be from a different portion of the woods than it had been before. It truly convinced me that there was someone else out there, and for some reason, this person was messing with me. These sorts of things continued into the next day. It was from the way they continued that kept freaking me out about what had been going on. If I had run into some other hikers, I may have felt better about it. It was overwhelming, though, being alone in those woods with someone clearly tailing and messing with me. By the time I was heading back to my car, I came upon a pretty narrow portion of the trail. There were branches that had been reaching across, and it had almost grown over. When I'd first seen it, it didn't seem like a safe place to move through, but I knew I had to do it. No sooner than I came upon this area, I saw the figure once again, this time up ahead of me. He was standing beyond the area I had to walk through and very quickly ducked out of my sight. I froze and didn't want to move forward. I knew I had to, though, in order to get out of these woods and back to my car. I slowly began making my way forward, worried the entire time. I can't even tell you what was going through my mind as I got there. As I squeezed through the end of that area, I noticed something on the ground that terrified me. There was blood splattered all over, and what looked to be some sort of mangled up small animal. I don't know what it was, though, because it had been so torn to shreds. I knew it had been left there to either scare or warn me. Either way, I wanted nothing to do with this. I think a lot of people may have run the rest of the way out, but I didn't want to do that. That would have made me more scared if I had begun running. I always had this thought that if something really was after me, running would only cause it to run after me faster. It was quite an unnerving and long walk through the rest of the wooded area until I got back to my car. As I did get back and began to drive off, I looked back at the area I'd come from. Once again, I noticed a black figure standing in the woods. When I got back to the cabin that you had to register in before going into the hiking area, I made sure to make a report of what I had seen. I let them know what I had seen and how the other hiker had been behaving. But for the time, I was the only hiker that had been registered to be on that trail. Whoever had been out there must have been out there without permission. This story takes place just last week. It was a Saturday evening just before sunset when I went to the dollar store to get a couple of snacks. I had been there a number of previous times. It was pretty close to my apartment. The store was called Dollar Tree and everything inside was around $1. I got to the store and parked my car. I got out and was walking in, and literally in the first aisle, a man began to approach me. He was wearing a green shirt with a Dollar Tree logo on it. The man approached me and told me that I wasn't allowed to be in here. I was really confused when he told me to get out of the store, and I asked him why. He said that it was because I was banned now. I knew for a fact that I had not been banned, though. I'd never had a bad interaction with anybody there. I told him he must have the wrong guy, and the man told me again to leave or he was going to call the police on me. I really couldn't believe it. I asked the guy what I'd done to get banned. He told me that I knew exactly what I did, and then motioned for me to leave right now. At this point, I really didn't know what was going on, but I figured that I would just leave anyway. This guy seemed to be pretty angry about it, and it didn't seem like he was going to listen to me no matter what I said. I started walking out of the store, and the man followed me the entire way. We both made it outside, and that's when the man told me to leave the property entirely. I asked him once more what was going on, but he wouldn't answer me. Instead, he told me not to get smart with him and asked me if I wanted to try him. I was not interested in fighting this guy, but as I was starting to walk back to my car, I noticed that out on the road a police car was starting to approach. The man who was with me turned around and just took off running, going around the side of the Dollar Tree building and behind it. There were some other businesses back there. I was still extremely confused, even more so at this point. The police car then pulled into the parking lot, and I just kinda stood there. After the police parked, 2 officers emerged from the vehicle, and one of them asked me if I had seen the guy who was pretending to work there. That's when I realized the guy who tried to kick me out of the store was a fake employee. I guess the police hadn't seen him running away when they were driving up. I said yes, and told the police where the man had run. One of the officers headed off in that direction, and the other officer went back inside. I went back to the Dollar Tree and found an employee. When I told her about what had happened, she said the guy had been pretending to work there, harassing multiple people. When they asked him to leave, he refused. They called the police. Then he went out of their sight. They thought that maybe he had left, but apparently he came back to harass me. I was able to complete my shopping, and by the time I was done, the police had left to catch up with that guy wherever he had gone. The man's behavior was very bizarre. That experience was certainly something I'll never forget. A few weeks ago, I was at home with my wife. We had gone for a walk around the neighborhood, which we often do after getting home from work. During the walk, we took note of the dark skies approaching, and in the last part when we got back to our street, it started to sprinkle. We quickly got inside. After getting inside the home, I started to prepare dinner. I was cooking a meat and pasta dish, and just beginning, when it really started storming. There was pouring rain, loud thunder, and within 5 minutes of this big storm hitting us, the power suddenly went out entirely. I had to stop and quickly put everything away. Obviously, I could not cook without power, and I couldn't see anything in the dark. We went around the house and found a couple of lanterns to use for some light. When we checked the weather radar on our phones, the storm did not seem like it would be staying around for too long. That was good at least. I was hoping it would blow over soon. In the meantime, it was pretty nasty out there. I remembered that a short time later, though, there was this really loud banging at the front door. It took both of us by surprise of just how loud it was. I went over to see who was out there, and when I looked out the front window, I saw that there were 3 large men standing there. I watched as one of them started banging on the door loudly again. I moved out of sight from the window in case they could see me. I didn't know who these men were or what they wanted, but based on the way they were pounding on the door, I didn't have any interest in finding out. I was hoping that they would just go away. I stood in a location where I could sort of see them from the window where I was, but didn't think they would be able to see me. After the men were at our door for about a minute, I saw 2 of them disperse in different directions. One of them went toward the side of my home, and the other went towards the window that I was looking towards. I quickly moved away from that area. I went over and found my wife near the kitchen and told her what was going on. She suggested that we call the police. Moments later, I began to hear a loud thudding coming from the side door, which was about 15 feet away from us. I called the police. There was now banging at the side door, front door, and a knocking on the window all at once. Suddenly, all the lights in our house came back on, and the power was restored. The instant this happened, all 3 men started sprinting away. They ran off of our property and out into the rain. I informed the police of this incident, and the storm lightened up a bit. After that, the men did not return. It was very strange, to say the least. Many years ago, a friend and I decided to take a bicycle trip together. Our goal was to bike most of the day on bike trails, then find a place to camp at night. We had made good progress towards our destination and arrived in about 2.5 days. We were going to relax in the small town that we were in for the rest of the day by swimming in the lake and getting a nice dinner in a restaurant. After eating beans and bread for the last couple of days, that was all we really needed to enjoy ourselves. We had been biking for quite a while. The bike trails that we were on didn't really have any good camping spots though, so we had been finding places that would work, like the edges of parks and backs of cemeteries. On this day, we found a quiet spot in the cemetery to camp for a night. Before starting the last half of the trip back home the next day, the spot we found was really nice. It was at the back area of the cemetery, out of view from the main street. There was a nice area of mulch which we set up our tent over to sleep on. That night was also the night before the 4th of July, so there were a decent amount of fireworks going off. My friend and I watched them go off, sitting outside of our tent. The sun had already set. While we were sat outside, there were multiple instances where we felt like we saw something move, some sort of motion out of the corner of our eyes. My friend and I had already slept in graveyards earlier on this biking trip, and we had gotten into the habit of walking around and reading the graves. It was something to do to pass the time. Partly because of the odd movements that we felt like we were seeing, and partly because we were bored, we grabbed a flashlight and began walking around, checking out the area. We even stumbled across one grave that really saddened us. It was a baby's grave, with a bunch of toy cars on the ledge of it. We normally didn't get spooked in graveyards, but we both glanced at each other. It got really windy and chilly for a second, then stopped as soon as it started. Thoroughly spooked now, we went back to the tent and had a restless night of sleep, waking up often. We were both relieved when we woke up as the sun was rising. We could begin to pack up and start our ride home. I opened the flap of the tent and was about to step outside when I saw something lying on the ground right outside of it. There were 2 toy cars laying outside, the same type from the grave we had seen last night. Both my friend and I swore that neither of us had done this during the night. We walked them over to the baby's grave, and sure enough, there were 2 empty spots where the cars had been last night. We finished wrapping up our stuff, and were on our way, leaving the graveyard. This happened back when I was a teenager and in high school. I was a freshman and lived in a house in the suburbs, not too far outside of the city. It was a densely populated area, and we lived about a mile away from a pretty large mall. It was also about a half-mile from my school, so it was a popular hangout for a lot of the kids. I would go there with friends after school some days, or on weekends other times. One weekend, I was at the mall with 4 of my friends, Jesse, Alex, Martin, and Lisa. We walked around and did some shopping. We were all hanging out in one of the food courts, sitting at a table and talking. It was at this time when a random woman suddenly approached the table. She appeared to be in her 30s and had dark blonde hair. She was wearing sunglasses inside. We all looked up at her, but the woman said that she needed to speak to me specifically. I didn't know why because I had never even met her before. I asked her what was going on, and she told me that I needed to follow her. I got up and asked her again what was going on. She said she had to talk to me. The woman then told me to follow her and she would explain everything, so I did. By now, I was very curious. We went to the end of the food court and turned down a random walkway in the mall. After walking for longer than I expected, the woman turned down another hallway. This one, though, was long and skinny, and there were no stores at all down the entirety of it. Just some storage closets or possibly janitor's rooms. I was very confused, but for some reason I kept walking. I also remember that at the end of the hallway there was an exit sign. When we got about halfway down, I actually saw the door to one of the storage closets open up. At least that's what I assumed those rooms were. When it did, 2 men emerged. They were both looking at me, and they were starting to approach. At this point, I still didn't know what was going on, but something about the situation gave me a bad feeling. I stopped where I was and asked the woman what was happening. She told me to just come on and follow her. The men were now moving faster in my direction. My instincts were telling me to leave, so I just turned around and started moving away. I heard footsteps moving after me and heard the woman yell at me to come back. I ignored it. This only made me go faster. I was able to make it back out to the normal walkway, but there were a few other people around. I did not see the woman or the 2 men leave that small hallway we had been in. I walked back to my friends, and they all asked me what that was about. When I told them what happened, they were all very confused. The 5 of us went back to the hallway to look, but the people were all long gone. We started walking around the mall and doing a little more shopping, but about 30 minutes later, I noticed the woman was now trailing a ways behind us, obviously tailing us. At that point, we decided to just leave. It was very weird. Luckily, we were not followed out of the mall after that, and I never saw any of those people again. I'm not sure what was going to happen, if the woman was setting me up to get robbed or something. I really don't know, but it was very suspicious. I live in a quiet neighborhood out in the suburbs. I enjoy going on walks around the neighborhood because there's a nice park area that goes in circles around a small pond. There's a playground there as well. Most evenings, I would take a short walk through the neighborhood and around the pond. I would get my exercise in for the day, and it was very relaxing to be out there in nature. One Saturday during the summer, I couldn't take my walk until later in the day because it had been raining all day. The rain finally stopped sometime close to 10 p.m., and even though I don't usually take these walks in the dark, I thought it would be nice to get out of the house after being inside all day long. I began taking my normal route through the neighborhood and toward the playground, which would lead into the path and walk around the pond. As I approached the playground area, though, I noticed there was a figure sitting there on the bench, dressed in all dark clothing. It was odd to see somebody out in the playground on this rainy night, but I thought it could be somebody like me, getting out of the home for a bit. As I continued and began to enter the path that would lead around the pond, I was surprised to see the person from the playground had gotten up and was now heading my way. It appeared they were going to take the same path around the pond that I was taking right behind me. I immediately felt uneasy, especially since this person was moving pretty quickly. I was nervous because the walk around the pond area was very dark. There were no lights in that area at all. I was extremely nervous about having this person behind me in the dark. As soon as I entered the darkness of that path, I began to run. Not a full sprint, mind you, but a speed considerably quicker than a jog. My fears reached a new level when about halfway around the pond in the distance behind me, I heard footsteps pounding on the pavement. The person who'd followed me onto that path had also begun to run, and it sounded like they were gaining on me. With less than half of the walk left, I increased my run to a full-on sprint so I could at least get back to the lighted area on the sidewalk by the main road. I managed to make it out of the wooded path before whoever was running behind me could catch up to me. I ran down the main street a bit back toward my house and kept looking back to see if someone would exit the path. Nobody emerged from that area. It appeared they had stopped and were staying in the dark area. I didn't see anybody for the rest of my walk home, but just in case, I took a different way back than I normally do. It involved many more turns through the neighborhood. It seems that whoever had been chasing me wanted to catch me on that stretch of path around the pond where it was completely dark and wooded. I'm glad I trusted my instincts and began running as soon as I entered that wooded area. Otherwise, the person may have caught up with me. That was the last walk I ever took after dark around my neighborhood, and I was still skeptical taking that path around the pond even during the day. A while ago, I would deliver pizzas for my summer job. I became a school teacher out of college, but the pay wasn't so great for my first couple of years. Over the summer months, when school wasn't in session, I worked a part-time job in pizza delivery. I worked at Domino's, and they stayed open quite late. Most of my shifts were night shifts that I would work into the early morning hours. It was on one of those early morning deliveries that ended up being the scariest encounter of my life. The order started out normally. I put the pizza, which had been ordered, into my vehicle and drove to the address listed. One thing I noticed when I was turning onto the street, though, was that there were no street lights at all. There was a row of 4 or 5 houses on one side, and on the other side of the street was the start of a wooded area, only about 10 feet away from the road. I parked in front of the last house on the block and walked up to the front door with the pizza in tow. There was no doorbell at this particular home, so I knocked as loudly as I could a couple of times. I waited a minute or two, but nobody came to answer the door. I couldn't exactly just leave the pizza on the front step, because we hadn't received any payment for it yet. I pounded one last time on the door, making it as loud as I could possibly be. Finally, a dim light turned on somewhere inside, and an older gentleman opened up. He grumpily told me that he hadn't ordered any pizza. I felt bad because it was obvious that I had woken him up from sleeping. I apologized, thinking I had the wrong address potentially. Still standing on the man's front step, I pulled out my phone to double-check the address, which was written down for the delivery. The address was correct, however, so it must have been a customer entering their address wrong. That did happen every once in a while. There wasn't much I could do, especially since there was no phone number given for the order. I had to just bring the pizza back to the store. I headed back to my car and went to the passenger side, putting the pizza in the front seat. I had just closed the door and was going to walk back around to my driver's side when I felt cold metal being pressed into the back of my head. I was being robbed. A deep-voiced man instructed me to give him all the cash. I instantly complied with his demands, handing him the cash pouch from my front seat that I carried around for deliveries. We fortunately emptied it fairly often, so there was only about $100 or so in there. The whole time I was grabbing the cash for the robber, I hadn't been allowed to turn around or face him. I held the money behind my back, and he took it forcefully. The man instructed me to not try and follow him and pushed me hard into the side of my car. I turned around just in time to see a figure disappearing into the woods and out of sight. I was breathing fast, and my heart raced the whole drive back to the store. I had never had a gun pointed at me before. It was a terrifying altercation. It was so odd to me for this whole elaborate plan to be set up. Scouting at a house in a good location near some woods and waiting for a pizza order just for not even a guaranteed small sum of money. The rest of the time I spent delivering pizzas, I never had another experience like that. Just in case, though, I always carried mace with me and got a better eye for my surroundings from then on. I'm currently a high school gym teacher. This is something that happened just last school year. One day, I was preparing for a class that I was about to teach. In the class, we were going to be using the high school gymnasium and doing some activities. For these activities, I needed to get some equipment, such as orange cones and whatnot. The school is kind of old, though, and the storage room for all that stuff is, for some reason, really far away from the gym. You had to walk down this really long hallway nearby. There were a few storage rooms toward the end of it. On this day, I left the gym and started walking down this long hallway to the storage room. When I opened up the door, it was mostly dark inside. Now, these storage rooms are very cluttered. Things are not organized at all. There are several shelves with random things on them, and various other things strewn all about. After getting inside, it was very dark. I didn't bother to turn on the light, though, because I knew exactly what I needed and where it was supposed to be. After taking a couple of steps inside, suddenly I heard a noise. Next thing I knew, one of the equipment shelves was falling over right on top of me. After landing on me, basically everything fell off the shelf on top of me as well. I wasn't badly hurt, but I had been knocked down and was now covered in random things. It all happened so quickly, but I knew that somebody was in here and had pushed over that shelf on purpose. It was not the sort of thing that would just suddenly fall over on its own. I pushed the junk off of me and looked around. I heard somebody moving around there, but I couldn't see who it was. I got up to my feet and was about to back out of the room into the hallway. That was when I heard another voice. I turned and just barely saw what looked to be a random man. He ducked out of view quickly and started to push over another shelf at me. I was able to get out of the room just before it came crashing down. As I left, I heard the guy coming to leave the room as well. As I was walking away, I saw the door open and saw the man emerge from the room. I knew this guy didn't work for the school, and this was obviously no student at all. I sprinted down the hall and ran back into the gym. When I got there, I took out my phone and reported the incident to the police. The school was put into lockdown. For the lockdown, I went into an otherwise vacant classroom that was really close to the gym. This classroom was not being used and did not belong to any teacher in particular. When I went inside, I was all by myself. I locked the door. As I was inside, maybe 5 minutes later, there was a sudden banging on the outside. I had a bad feeling about this. I walked over and tried to peek and see who was out there. I saw the same man from before. As soon as he saw me, he tried to open the locked door. He began to pound on it and acted like he was trying to break the door open. Luckily, the school's doors were very strong. I went back over to my desk and reported the guy's location. I hoped that would get him to leave me alone and that he would be caught soon. He continued to attack the door for a good 5 minutes. When the police arrived, they were able to get the man and leave the school with him. I'm not sure how he even got in the first place. Maybe he had been hiding in that storage room for a while, possibly as long as a day. I still can't believe he pushed the shelf over onto me. If he hadn't done that, I might have never known he was there. I'm glad that I and everyone else in the school was okay. Every time I go to those storage rooms now, though, I still get worried that some random person will just be hiding in there. This happened back when I was in high school. It was during my senior year in the fall semester. I remember that I had study hall, and during this time I would often go to the library. We were allowed to, but I was one of the only students that took advantage of this. Most of the other kids just liked to stay in their classroom and work there. If I didn't have any homework, I would stay in the classroom myself. But when I was working on stuff, I'd go to the library. It was much easier to focus there. One day, I was in the library doing homework during study hall. I was listening to music on my headphones, and I was able to finish my work with a little bit of time left over in class. I was going to leave the library early to go to my locker before the final class of the day. At my high school, the rules were not really that strict. You didn't even really need a pass to walk in the hallways during class periods. I headed out from the library, I think about 4 or 5 minutes before class would be let out. I walked back to my locker, which took a few minutes. I put my books away and grabbed the one for my final class, then stood around at my locker and looked at the time. Class was supposed to be out by now, but I was not seeing any students in the hallways at all. This made me confused. At this point, I took out my headphones, which had been in the entire time playing music. Things around me were eerily silent. I was really confused. I walked to my next classroom, but when I got there, the door was locked. At this point, I still hadn't thought of the possibility of a lockdown. I started heading back to my locker, thinking about what could possibly be going on. I hadn't heard the lockdown announcement because I had my headphones in when it was made. I made it back to my locker and saw the halls were still empty. I checked my watch and phone for the time, and my times were not off at all. I couldn't understand where everybody was. That was when I finally realized there must be a lockdown going on. At first, I was thinking and hoping that maybe it was just a drill. I started going to my classroom again. I was going to knock on the door so my teacher would be able to let me in. I had to go down a couple of hallways to get there, but as I went down one and passed by a staircase, I heard multiple people moving down. I looked back and saw 3 men going down the stairs. Each of them were wearing all black clothing and had ski masks on. Instantly, I had an ominous feeling about it. I kept watching and moving, then quickly ducked around a corner. When I did, I looked back for a moment and saw all 3 of the men were now looking in my direction and starting to move toward me. They were a long ways back, but it was still terrifying. At this point, I could only assume the school had been locked down because of them. I quickly went around the corner and hoped the men wouldn't follow me. As I made it to the end of that hallway, I looked back. I thought for a second I was good, but then I noticed all 3 of the men running around the corner and coming towards me. I was terrified. I started moving fast toward the end of the hallway. When I made it toward the end, I recognized a classroom. It was one of a teacher I had previously, who I knew pretty well. It was a risk to stop, but I decided to start knocking on the door extremely fast. I called out the teacher's name. There was no response. I tried the door, but of course it was locked. I turned around and saw the men approaching me. They looked right at me. For a moment, I was about to turn and run, but then the door opened. I quickly went inside and shut the door, then locked it behind me. The men did not try to enter the room or to knock on the door. They must have passed by. I'm confident the men were going to go after me until I got into the classroom. The lockdown continued for a while after. I told the teacher about those guys, and she called it in. Eventually, after 30 more minutes, the lockdown finally ended. The 3 men had left the school grounds, but they were tracked down anyway. I never really learned much more about it. I just know that it was one of the scariest moments of my life when I saw those guys chasing me down the hallway. I'm glad everybody was okay in the end. Every year, the village I live in has a weekend-long festival in the fall, just to celebrate the town and have a good time. It's sort of like a miniature fair, with a bunch of vendor tents set up, food trucks, live music, the whole works really. The festival takes place in a big park in town, which I happen to live right next to. I've lived on my own for a while. Now, in this place, we've had some creepy events take place during the weekend of the festival. 2 years ago, on the first day of the festival on Friday night, I had been sitting out on my balcony outside of my bedroom, watching the fireworks as I do every year. There was plenty of light to illuminate my backyard from the fireworks. As I was watching, I suddenly saw a hooded figure come up the path from the park and walk down the property line between my house and my neighbor's yard. I assumed it was somebody from the festival, taking a shortcut to get home by going through people's yards. Needless to say, I was a bit shocked when the hooded figure suddenly took a sharp turn and approached one of my downstairs windows and looked inside my home. It appeared this person hadn't seen me up on the balcony. They continued around the house toward the door, which was directly under my balcony. I couldn't see them from where I was, but I heard my screen door quietly open as the person attempted to open the main door. Thankfully, it was locked. I yelled out from the balcony, using some vulgar language for them to get out of here. The hooded figure bolted from the door and ran out of my yard back into the park. Fast forward to exactly 1 year later, to the day. I did my normal routine of going to the festival and then watching the fireworks from my balcony. The fireworks ended close to 11 p.m., and I went to bed soon after. I was woken not much later by the sound of my screen door opening. I quietly descended the stairs to the living room and approached the door. From what I could tell, there was nobody there. When I turned back to go upstairs, though, I saw a hooded figure staring at me through the living room window. I couldn't see much, but I could tell that it was a man. What was scariest about the situation was when he noticed me looking at him. He didn't flinch or duck out of view at all. He simply continued to stare at me. At this point, I was truly spooked, remembering the incident from last year, which happened on the same night of the festival. I had my cell phone on me, so I called the police immediately. I was still standing in the living room. Once the hooded man saw I was talking to somebody on the phone, he dipped out of view. The cops came and didn't find anybody still around on my property. I explained to them the nature of the scenario, of the multiple incidents which happened back-to-back years now, and how I was convinced it was the same person. There wasn't really much they could do. This year, the village festival is coming up in a couple of weeks, and I've arranged to have a friend stay over with me that night. I'm hoping that nothing will happen for the 3rd straight year in a row, but I've definitely been on edge about it as the festival draws near. This is something that happened back when I was a kid. I was about 8 or 9. Back then, I used to play out in the street with my friends during the summertime. Most of the neighborhood kids would all hang out there as well. I remember that we would all have to go inside by sunset typically. So one evening, I was on my street a ways down from my home. I was hanging out with about 3 or 4 other kids who lived nearby. I don't remember exactly what we were doing. All I know is that the sun was starting to set. After a while, 2 of the other kids had to go. I was thinking that I should probably start heading back soon as well. However, I did not immediately go inside. Instead, me and these 2 other kids were still in the street talking. We were a ways down from my house. Normally, the street would be really quiet, and not very many cars would drive down it. I remember, though, that right when it was starting to get really dark out, we saw this truck enter the street from the other end. We all moved over to the side of the road and noticed the truck was going very slowly. Soon, we saw that it was an ice cream truck, and it began playing the typical ice cream truck music, except it was at a very quiet volume. Must have been turned almost all the way down. As the truck approached, I personally had mixed feelings. I was always happy to see an ice cream truck during the summer, but something felt odd about it driving basically at nighttime with the volume down so low. The 3 of us kids remained on the side of the street. We were going to let the truck pass by. I realized that the truck most likely was not going to sell ice cream at this hour. When the truck got close to us, it started to slow down even more, and then stopped altogether. The 3 of us just continued to stand there, now staring at this ice cream truck in the road. The truck sat there running for what felt like a long time. I was really curious about this situation. Finally, the driver's door slid open, and a man stepped out and said hi to us. We said hi back to him, and the man asked us if we wanted some ice cream. He said that it was the end of the day, and he had some left over that we could have for free. This sounded good to us. I was quick to say yes. The man then told us to go ahead and get inside of his truck. He moved back and was going to open the back door. That's when I got a real bad feeling about this. There was a suspicion that I probably should not get inside of that truck. The other 2 kids started to walk over, and I didn't know what to do. I just started following them. I was telling myself that nothing bad would happen. I remembered that as we made it around to the back, the guy was just standing there inside the truck. I heard my sister's voice and looked over to my house. It was probably 100 feet down the street. My older sister was yelling at me to come inside because I wasn't supposed to be out past dark. When I saw her, she was standing at the edge of the yard. She then seemed to notice the ice cream truck. My sister would have been about 15 at the time, so a lot older and more mature than me. She asked what was going on and started to move closer. That's when the ice cream man suddenly slammed the back door of the truck. The other kids that I was with took off running in the other direction to go back to their houses. It all happened so fast. My sister started yelling at me to get away from the vehicle. All 3 of us kids ran away. Meanwhile, within seconds, the ice cream truck started driving off. I got back to our house, and my friends went back to theirs. I went inside, and my sister told my parents about what just happened. They didn't let me leave the front yard without supervision for a few weeks after. I'd learned my lesson, though, and I was always suspicious whenever I saw another ice cream truck. This happened last night, about 1:15 midnight. I was in my bed trying to get to sleep when I suddenly heard a frantic knocking on my door. I walked out of my bedroom while the knocking continued on. I heard a woman whispering through my door, "Please, help me," along with crying. It was very faint though, almost inaudible. I looked out the peephole, only to see no one was there. No other doors were being knocked on either, only mine. This was already quite odd by itself, but I was on the 3rd floor of my complex. Why would someone walk all the way up to just my apartment if they were in such distress? Immediately, I took note of something odd sounding about this voice as well. I thought it must be a recording. If someone really needed help, wouldn't they be banging on everyone's door? I called the police immediately, and the dispatcher told me not to open the door no matter what. He asked if I had a weapon as well. I'd heard of this tactic before, albeit with a slightly different variation, that being a recording of a baby crying outside. It's just insane when thinking about the statistics. Stranger abductions usually result in murder. Just so sick to try and prey on people's empathy. Police drove by and I saw them using their spotlight to look throughout the entire complex. As of now though, no one was found out there. If by chance someone really was hurt, I hope they did find her. I barely slept with all the possibilities of how this person found me, where they saw me, and when they followed me. Did they live in the same complex maybe? I'm 4'10" and live alone, and don't know many people in my area. No close family either. Had someone been watching me and known all this or something? It's just making me go crazy. Stay vigilant and don't fall for these sorts of tactics. This happened about a year ago. If I hadn't already heard of that baby recording thing, I may have actually opened the door. I don't know where I would be right now if I would have. Update. I've talked with the management to let them know what happened. As of right now, not a single other person reported anything similar happening, and nobody else heard that voice either. I'm gonna call the police again for an update too. I was redirected to another PD, but they weren't the ones who initially responded. I know it takes some time for reports to be filed, so I'm trying my best to be patient. I want to know if this has happened to anyone else. As far as it being a prank, I guess it could possibly be. I'd be more inclined to believe that though if it had happened to anybody else in the apartment complex. Maybe it had, but they hadn't said anything. This happened when I was in college. I was home for the summer working, and my boyfriend was also home for the summer living with his parents. They were about an hour and a half away. We finally had a rare day when neither of us needed to work, so we drove down to spend the entire day with me. We were saving for the coming school year, so we tried not to spend too much. That ended up meaning we ate lunch and dinner with my family at my house. We didn't get much alone time because of this. After dinner, we wanted to have some time to ourselves as a couple, so we decided to pick up some root beer floats at Sonic and drive out to a local state park where young couples like to hang out. We parked and walked out to one of the little covered picnic tables in the woods. While the parking lot itself was well lit, because of how thick the woods were, it was quite dark sitting at the picnic table. We'd hung out there late into the night before though, and it had always been perfectly safe. For some reason this time though, I felt really nervous sitting in the dark when another couple popped out of the woods just past where we were and started making out leaning up against each other at the other end of the table. We moved to my boyfriend's pickup. My boyfriend turned on the radio for some ambiance, and we sat in companionable silence attempting to eat our ice cream before too much of it melted. Due to the heat, we had the windows rolled down as well. After a while, the couple we'd seen burst out of the woods and left. Looking around, I realized something quite odd. Although there were normally at least half a dozen vehicles parked in this particular lot on any evening, we were the only vehicle in sight tonight. Even so, I didn't really think too much of it and continued to finish up my ice cream. All of a sudden, out of nowhere though, I got the most horrifying feeling. You know that feeling when your hair immediately stands up on the back of your neck? You can feel someone looking at you when you thought you were alone. It was just like that, except so much worse. I had the distinct feeling I needed to run right now in the pit of my stomach. I started looking around the woods frantically and realized my boyfriend was also searching as well. I asked him if he also got a bad feeling. His reply was an emphatic hell yes. He started the truck and began to drive out of the park. Since we were facing into the park, he had to make a U-turn to turn around. As we passed back by the area where we'd been parked, a man stepped out of the edge of the woods. This happened on a Wednesday night. About a week later, someone found bodies in the woods just past where we'd been seated at the picnic table. When the crime was eventually solved, it came out a man was living in a hidden shack on the property. He was working as a maintenance worker for the park during the day and killed a couple on that Saturday night just after we left. The photo of the killer in the newspaper was the photo of the man we'd seen step out of the woods and watch us leave. This experience happened to my roommates and I in our second year of university. The city we went to school in was considered a very safe university town. The most we had heard of happening was some drunk morons doing typical drunk moron things. This was also the first time we were really living on our own. First-year residences are nice, but it's basically an extended summer camp rather than a typical living situation. The four of us girls lived in a nice townhouse that never once had a creepy vibe or weird neighbors or anything like that in the months we lived there. The only eerie part really was that every weekend we were the only people who actually stayed in the complex. All of our neighbors either went home or stayed elsewhere until returning Monday for classes. This was never something we had given a second thought to though, considering this was fairly normal for a university town, especially because our complex was only made up of 4 other townhouses. The complex itself was surrounded by walking trails and farm fields, which we all quite liked actually. It was like a nice quiet spot away from all the chaos of other college kids. There were a few farmhouses we could see from our backyard, but other than that, we were pretty secluded. The university was about a 20-minute bus ride away. That was never a big deal for any of us though, especially because the rent was far cheaper here than other places within walking distance. Being 5'6", I was the tallest by a considerable margin. I was also the only one of the entire group who had been in a handful of scary situations. Due to this, I was the only one who would ever remember to lock the doors, window, and garage before leaving or going to bed. My roommates all grew up in small, very safe towns, so it was very uncommon for them to lock their doors back at home. They were also incredibly kind and trusting to everyone. You know the type, never considering anyone has hidden bad intentions. The night in question started off very normally. We had planned on having a wine and movie night together. This was kind of a weekly tradition for us. We would pick some dumbass movie, get takeout, and get a little bit of a buzz going after a week of long classes and work. At this point, it was early November, so we had been doing this for several months with no issue. By 8:30ish, we had all settled on the couch in our living room and started up a comedy. With it being November, it was already completely dark outside now, other than our porch light you could see from the small window at the very top of our door. None of us were tall enough to actually see anything out of that window anyway, so we relied entirely on our peephole. It took a great deal of effort for me to convince my roommates to ever check the peephole before opening the door. This was a talk I had to have with them after one roommate had opened the door for our neighbor's very drunk friend, who proceeded to vomit all over everything. Not long after ordering some takeout, we heard a banging on our front door. My friend Jess made a joke about how the delivery guy must have taken a helicopter or something to get here this quickly, especially considering the place we ordered from was very close to campus. This was not a typical delivery guy's knock either. Between the few glasses of wine and carefree attitude of the night though, we didn't really pay it much mind. It was my roommate's turn to pay this week. I'll call her Meg for the purposes of the story. Out of the group, she was the smallest, less than 5 feet tall. She was also the most naive, trusting person I've ever met. She ran up to her room to grab her wallet. This took at most 30 seconds. During this time, the banging continued and was getting even more aggressive. I figured maybe it was cold or he had other shit to do, so we yelled at her to hurry up. The banging, though, continued to get harder and harder, and I started to feel a bit uneasy. When she came back down, I told her not to open the door just yet. checked the peephole before opening it, as she was usually the one to just open it up the most. She got to the door and tried to peek out the peephole, but she could barely reach it on a good day. When she said she couldn't see anything, my other roommate and I got up to help her. My second roommate, Jess, was kind of a funny gal. There are very few things she would not turn into a joke. She got to the door before I did and looked out the peephole. The person on the other side was still banging away. The way she turned to look at me, I instantly knew something was wrong. She looked confused, a look I had rarely ever seen on her, as she was very clever. Within a second, she went back to look. This time, she looked afraid. This made my stomach knot up. She was not a person to scare easily. "I think someone is covering the peephole," she whisper shouted at us. This time, I looked out too, and yeah, something was covering up the peephole so we couldn't see outside. We could still see the porch light shining through the window at the top, so we knew it was not a case of being too dark to see what was going on outside. By now, our other roommate, who I'll call Annie, walked down the hall trying to find out what was going on. She was easily the drunkest of the four of us. Even sober though, she seemed to always think she was invincible. "What's your problem, guys? Open the door. The poor dude has his hands full already." Jess and I explained what was going on. That's when Jess was sober enough to ask Meg to check the website she had ordered our food on. Meg was so drunk she'd never even placed the order. She had selected our food but never finished the last step. The banging continued as the situation started to sink in. Anne was so drunk though, she still seemed to not grasp what was happening and went to go unlock the door. "Stop!" I snapped at her. Immediately I knew I had been too loud. For the first time, the person on the other side of the door spoke. "Ma'am, this is the police. Open the door now. We have some questions for you." That sobered me up right away. I looked over at Meg, who was already welling up and panicking, then at Jess, who had gone completely pale and was no help either. The banging was getting increasingly harder, to the point we could physically see the door banging in with each hit. Meg took Anne upstairs trying to calm each other down and check if there really was a police car parked outside. They made sure our windows were locked too. Though it was hard to do, there was a possible area to get onto part of our roof that made it possible to get to Anne's window. We heard a window slam, immediately knowing it had been Anne's. Being a bit of a thrill seeker, Anne had jumped out her window screen in order to sit on the roof and check out the situation. "Show me your badge and then we'll open the door," I yelled back. Instead of a response though, the man started to try and kick in the door. I told Jess to call the police and ask if they had an officer dispatched to our address. She was shaking so badly it was hard for her to dial. Now Meg had come back downstairs, sharing that there was no police car parked outside. Anne trailed behind her, standing on the stairs trying to get a look outside the window at the top of the door. At that moment, my blood ran cold. I just remembered the man at the other side of the door had said "we," not "I." Jess came to the same realization. She sprinted to our back door, a large sliding glass door, which she double-checked was locked. Thankfully, it was. She drew the curtains shut as well, trying to minimize the chance of them seeing in. Within just a minute, knocking started at our back door as well. Thank God she closed the curtains, because the idea of seeing whoever was doing this still gives me chills. "Uncover the peephole and show me your badge," I yelled again, trying to sound as intimidating as I could. We were met with sudden silence, so much worse than the previous banging. "What's your badge number at least? Prove to us that you're the police," I screamed, trying to keep my voice from breaking. The only response I got back was a very quiet, "I can't do that." Jess handed her phone off to Meg, who was sobbing now trying to speak to the dispatcher. The banging coming from both sides of the house must have been heard by them. They asked if someone was trying to break in. Meg frantically asked if the police had been sent yet. The answer, we all knew by now, was no. Meg babbled that at least 2 people were trying to get us to unlock the door by impersonating officers. The operator then told us police would be there in no more than 10 minutes. That made us all even more wary. We realized just how long 10 minutes really is. The door was now being hit so hard, I was worried it would actually break the frame. Jesse ran toward our back door, making me worry perhaps our kitchen window had been left open. Trying to think, I slammed a chair underneath the doorknob, hoping the door would hold now. Jesse came back to the front door, holding a kitchen knife and a fire extinguisher. We had nothing to really deter whoever wanted in. No prods and no backup until the real police showed up. It was not anything like they were used to. All of them had grown up having family as neighbors their entire life. If anything were happening, their uncles and grandfathers were at their front door in a minute flat. Now, the invincible farm girl attitude was long gone. Everyone was scared. There was only some wood and glass keeping these men out now. And with the force of the hits against the back door, I was worried the glass would break any moment. "Open the fucking door!" the man yelled at us, not even pretending to be police anymore. Then it got silent again. The only worse thing than what was happening in that moment was not knowing where the men were now. The idea of both men moving to the glass back door made me terrified. If they really wanted to, they could easily smash through that plate glass. After, there was no more knocking at the back door though. Within seconds, the front door was being slammed even harder. I was trying to wrap my mind around why they would leave the easiest entry point for a heavy wooden door. Then I realized the back door was visible by the main road. Whether they'd seen a car or heard us talking to the police, they were smart enough to move to the other entrance. Jess then said something I hadn't thought of at the moment. "I don't think they want to rob us, guys. There are houses all around us that are empty, so why did they come to the only house with the lights on?" My whole body went cold. I didn't have an answer. Meg started hyperventilating. The three of us stayed quiet for a minute, awful scenarios running through our minds. Anne moved back up the last steps and out of sight of us. The operator, who we'd forgotten was on speaker, spoke, which practically made me jump out of my skin. "The police are just 2 minutes away. They have their sirens turned off and the lights are on. You should see them very soon. Stay on the phone with me so I can confirm when they're outside for you." The men outside were starting to get desperate. The sound of glass suddenly shattering had me turning back to the back door. I was fully expecting someone to burst in. The door was still intact though. Instead, our porch light, the only thing illuminating our area, was suddenly put out. We put two and two together. They had destroyed the only way we would have been able to identify who was on the other side. "You fucking little whores." A voice we hadn't heard before suddenly shouted through the door as well, much worse than the initial speaker. It was full of hate and venom. It scared me more than the other person. This person had a goal. I didn't like how this sounded. Up until this point, I could have possibly convinced myself they just wanted our things, but this voice made me understand they wanted us. To this day, I've never heard someone come close to that level of malice. It sounded like he hated us for some reason. Somehow, I wished the first man would speak again instead of this guy. Until now, I had done a half-decent job of hiding how scared I was, but that voice ruined my ability to stay stone-faced. If they got in now, there was nothing we would be able to do to stop them. Not me, not my friends. We would have been at their complete mercy. Jess had practically stopped breathing. It was like the oxygen had been sucked out of the air. It was so quiet, it sounded like a gunshot when we heard our mailbox open. Anne suddenly ran back down the stairs. "I see the sirens, guys. They're coming down the main road now," she whispered, hoping the men didn't hear. The same man spoke again, one more time, so slowly I thought he was almost done after each word. In that same awful voice, he read out a letter addressed to the four of us, one our neighbor must have put in the box today. She had planned a potluck for the next week. None of us had thought to check the mailbox after we had talked to her in the driveway this morning. Jess, Meg, Anne, and LP, huh? Those are nice names. I'll be back soon, girls. Then we'll have some real fun. Tears started rolling down my face. I hadn't realized I'd started crying. I knew he meant what he said. I tried to pull my mind out of that dark pit that sentence had sent it to. I was waiting, praying the police had surprised them and caught them, hoping they wouldn't ever get the chance to come back. The silence continued. None of us dared to speak, worried we wouldn't hear if they moved to another point of entry. Instead, the silence persisted for what felt like a lifetime. The operator was the one to break it, telling us the police were now out front. She told us to stay in the house while the police searched the area. That kind person stayed on the phone with us for several more minutes, while the police searched everywhere. Finally, the real officer showed their badge through the peephole, before even knocking. They did their best not to scare us. The operator told us we had done well, and we were in good hands now. We opened the door to be met by two kind-looking, older officers, who we let in. Glass shards covered our front stoop from our porch light. It looked like it had been ripped out of the wall and smashed on the concrete below. There were several cars out front of our previously quiet home. The headlights on all of them were shining down the street, toward the walking trail. We spoke to the officers who took a report from us. They asked us to describe the night's events in detail. They asked us if we'd saw the men at all, and we explained how the peephole had been covered up and the light had been smashed before moving away from the door. The officers advised us to speak to our landlord about, at the very least, some security cameras. An older officer then closed the pad he had been writing in and looked up at us. He then spoke a phrase that made me understand how much danger we had been in. "Look, if any of you were my daughters, I would have wanted the officer to tell her. If you can get out of your lease, do it right now. These people know where you all live, and now they know the response time for us, especially after telling you they would be back." After that, they asked if we had heard a vehicle, something I hadn't considered. We didn't hear any type of motor until the police arrived. Even when Meg and Ann had gone upstairs to look for a police car, they had seen no vehicles on the street at all. That meant the men had come from the walking path, which would explain how they left without passing the police on their way back to the main road. The older officer of the two had a look that told me he had an idea of what was going on. He looked sad, which was worse than if he had looked scared. I knew he had seen this kind of situation and far worse in the past. We pushed for an explanation, but were only told it had been an issue years ago in the area and did not elaborate past that point. The officer stood up, exchanged a glance I didn't understand how to read, and then spoke again. "We'll have a cruiser parked in the driveway, as well as a plain car around back. They won't have the chance to try again anytime soon." They didn't catch the man in the 2 more weeks we lived there. We had a few creepy things happen, but nothing close to this. The reality was, they had never been caught, and they could return at any time. After this night, we spoke to our landlady, who was thankfully very incredible. She owned several more properties around the city, and when we explained what had happened, she let us move to a different apartment she owned closer to campus. She told us our safety was more important than making a couple extra $100. She even left that old house empty for many months in order to make sure cameras, better locks, and reinforced doors were installed. She didn't want the people who moved in next to have to deal with anything shady either. Thankfully, those guys never came back, and we were able to enjoy our new apartment without much worry. It's still so scary to me though. Make sure to always lock your doors and check who's there before opening them. When I was probably 13, my family and I were on our way home from a Wednesday night church service. My mom was in the driver's seat, and I was behind her in the back. My 5-year-old brother was in the middle, and my 10-year-old sister on his other side. We were just down the road from the church, but it was a country road and late at night. This meant there was no light, and no one else on the road either. We were just coming up to our turn, when all of a sudden, a car came swerving from our turning spot. This little car was taking the turn so fast, they came into our lane and almost slammed right into us. We swerved as they tried to get in their own lane before we collided. Unfortunately for them, they overcorrected. Their car flipped and landed on the driver's side door in the ditch. My mom, of course, hit the brakes and immediately jumped out of the car to go help whoever was in there. She got about 3 steps away from our car before she stopped dead in her tracks. My sister and I were just sitting there, our mouths hanging wide open and having no clue what to do. All I could think to myself was, this can't be happening. This kind of stuff only happens in the movies. But why wasn't my mom going to help this person now? It was summer, so we had our windows halfway down. I could hear a person yelling for help from inside. My mom started moving again to help them, but for some reason, she stopped again in the center of the road. Another car flew past us. This guy didn't hesitate to jump out and run to the crash to help. The man got to the car and started prying the passenger door open so the man inside could climb out. I could see my mom wanted to run and help, but it was like she was rooted to the spot. That good Samaritan that pulled up behind us was able to get the door popped open. The guy from inside crawled out and got into a frog-like crouching position on top of the car. At this point, my mom started shuffling back to our vehicle. When I looked back at the man, he had this crazy look on his face. He looked directly at our car, and my mom as well. He launched himself off the top and started attacking the guy who was helping him. While that man was down, he turned and started sprinting for our car at the same time. My mom turned and made a run for it. He must have known he couldn't get there before my mom did, because he changed directions and moved to grab the car behind us. My mom jumped in and locked our doors, just as this man jumped into the empty driver's seat of that good Samaritan. He slammed on the gas before he'd even closed the door and almost hit us, taking off a second time. Next thing we know, the guy who was just carjacked ran up to my mom's window and started screaming and knocking on it. My mom was of course shaken and didn't want to roll down the window now. She settled for cracking it open just a bit so he could understand what the man was saying. He was yelling for us to call 911 because he'd left his phone in the car along with his girlfriend. Of course, my mom started searching for her phone. She was so frantic from what had just happened though, she couldn't seem to find it. I took a break from keeping my little brother and sister calm and dialed 911 on my own phone. While she was explaining what happened to the operator, we heard a woman screaming down the road. The man that was out our window took off running. A few minutes later, he came back with a severely scraped up woman in his arms that turned out to be his girlfriend. My mom unlocked the doors at this point and let the woman sit in the passenger seat while we waited together for the cops. The girlfriend told us he'd noticed her while he was speeding off and tried to attack her too. She managed to scratch his eye and punched him while trying to plead with him to stop the car. He kept on trying to attack her though. Finally, he rolled down the window and pushed her out while going 60. The cops finally showed up and talked to all of us to get our stories. While talking to one officer, he told my mom the man had apparently shot and killed the man behind some apartment complex. That's why he was driving so fast and trying to get away. When we finally got home, we were all told to just go to bed. But of course, I wouldn't be able to sleep that night. I went downstairs to talk to my mom. I worked up the courage to ask her why she'd stopped running to the car when the other guy didn't. She told me she had such a strong feeling that she should stay in the car with us. It was almost like she could physically hear it. When she heard him start yelling for help, she wanted to go again. But just like last time, she got the overwhelming feeling something was wrong. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if my mom hadn't listened to that feeling. The man could have easily overpowered her and gotten to the car if she had been any further away. I should also mention that man was caught that night trying to steal a new car. He had already ditched the car he'd stolen from behind us, so the thing that really helped him get convicted was that woman fighting him off. She'd managed to grab the wrap off his head before being pushed out. She didn't even know she did because of adrenaline until the police arrived and she found it by where she was pushed. The man did go to jail, but I was never informed for how long or anything else. And honestly, I don't really care to ask. I grew up in a small, rural town where nothing ever happens. The sort of place where it wasn't unusual to leave your doors unlocked, and your closest neighbors were a mile or so away from your own house. Our family had this giant old cat, Tag. He was a bit of a drama king, but we loved him all the same. One summer, when I was around 9 or 10 years old, Tag just suddenly started going ballistic out of nowhere. Generally, he would just sleep in my room curled up next to me until I fell asleep as well. Then he would get up and do whatever cat-like things he'd do all day. Occasionally he would meow or try to wake me up on those unfortunate nights he could see the bottom of his food bowl and needed a midnight snack or something. Usually, if I just ignored him, he would give up or try to go wake up my mom instead. On this night, however, he was banging his body against my parents' bedroom door. He was meowing loud enough to wake everyone up. Our bedroom doors were all right next to each other. I called Tag to come to bed because it was now about 2 a.m. He was having none of it though. He was still just going absolutely crazy. My mom went down to the kitchen, then huffed back up with Tag on her heels, still meowing insanely. When she checked, his bowl still had plenty of food. He just walked her to the door of the kitchen and watched it. Tag was an indoor/outdoor cat, but he had his own cat door through the garage. There was no need for one of us to let him out ourselves. My mom said my brother must have left the kitchen door open or something. Just the screen door was shut. She wasn't going to hold it open forever for the cat to just stand there and not go outside though. Eventually she got fed up, shut the kitchen door and went back to sleep, firmly shutting her own bedroom door and not letting Tag back inside their room. I always kept treats for him in my own room. I offered him one, but he was still meowing at their door, trying to get them to get up. I grabbed him and brought him into my room and shut my door to try and get him to sleep. I lay in bed, trying to go back to bed. Tag just kept meowing at my door, wanting to go back out. Finally, I got fed up and opened my door. He bolted right back downstairs, towards the kitchen, and that's when I heard what sounded like a door slamming. I have 3 older siblings, so someone was always up watching TV or running to the bathroom or something. At first, I didn't think anything of it. The cat finally stalked back into my room, but instead of curling up in my armpit like usual, he sat at the bottom of my bed, staring vigilantly at my door. I fell asleep until morning, when some commotion woke me up. I padded my way down to the kitchen to find my parents on the phone with the police. They got up as usual to get ready for work, and while making coffee, my mom went to grab her rings from the little jewelry dish she had by the sink. She would take them off in the evenings to rinse dishes and load the dishwasher, but discovered that that tray was empty this morning. It was a small town, so the sheriff sent a deputy over right away. When my dad walked out to meet with them, he saw the ATV was missing from out back as well. The key was off the ring. My brothers were all up at this point too. We were all freaked out that while we were just sleeping there, some robber had entered our home, removed the ATV key, and even saw an opportunity to steal my mom's rings. They were asking if we had any clue when it happened, and my parents said no. My mom asked my middle brother, who was a freshman in college and home for the summer, what time he'd ended up off the couch last night, and if he'd heard anything. He'd gone to bed at 10 or 11 and asked what she meant, as his bedroom was in the basement. He wouldn't have heard anything in the kitchen. My mom then said something odd. "But you were in the living room just off the kitchen when I went to feed the cat and shut the door. You left it open, remember? I told you not to sleep on the couch anymore and to go back to bed when I went upstairs." He told my mom he was already in the basement since dinner time and never went out to come upstairs again. He'd watched a movie in the basement instead before falling asleep in his own bedroom. She went white and realized the cat must have been trying to warn us someone was in our house. The robber had dove onto the couch and covered up to hide when she came to the kitchen. He'd exited right after she went back to bed. The cops said that for someone to be so brazen, they probably knew our family, knew our habits, but didn't count on the fact that the cat was so overprotective. They had probably intended to do more, but were afraid the cat may have woken the whole house. It's been over 20 years since this happened. The robber was never caught. It's unnerving to think it was probably someone who had been in our home before as a friend. Okay, I guess I should start this story by giving a bit of background so you understand the situation a bit better. I'm a 4'9" girl. I was 16 years old at the time this happened. We had 2 dogs who were brothers from the same litter. Being boxers, they were relatively big and quite protective when need arise. Vince was longer and much taller than his brother, and was usually the kind to sleep through a hurricane if there ever was one. His brother Maury was shorter but more muscled. Stronger, I guess I'd say. Usually these two were with me 24/7, as my mother used to work quite a lot. This meant I was usually alone most of the day, sometimes even well after dark. This never really bothered me though. I'd been left alone at home like this since I was 11 years old. It never really struck me I'd have any reason to be worried. One day, my mom was working quite a bit later. I was doing some household chores, feeding the dogs, doing dishes, random housecare stuff like that. I continued doing what I usually did, a routine of tidying the house I'd grown accustomed to every day for years. As I went to take the trash out of the bins though, I started walking toward the door when Maury stepped in front of me suddenly. I tried to move around him, telling him to get out of my way, but he refused to budge no matter what. This was certainly odd. Looking back on it now, a few years later, I realized he must have been trying to stop me from walking outside. We continued like this for a few moments, me trying to move past him, and him, of course, never moving from his spot. He was quite heavy as a big dog, so it was difficult to move him around, even harder to get him away from something. In the time we'd been going back and forth with this interaction, Vince had stayed happily asleep on his dog bed. I should note that from my kitchen, you can see the living room and bathroom. Usually we use the slide door from the kitchen to enter and exit the house, since it was attached to the carport. After a couple more minutes though, I heard something I never expected when I made one last desperate attempt to move Maury out of the way. He growled, which wasn't unusual. He'd growled plenty in his life. What was unusual though was that he was growling at me. He had never done that before, not even once. For that simple reason alone, I decided against taking the trash out that night. I simply tossed it in another room and left it to take out in the morning. A short time passed, maybe a half hour or so. I'd gotten settled into my chair to watch some movie while I waited for my mom to finally arrive home. While I was sitting there in the quiet ambiance of that movie, I suddenly heard a very faint knock at the side door. As I mentioned before, you can clearly see the living room from the kitchen, so I heard the knock pretty well even though it was so quiet. It was already well after dark. I figured maybe it was just my mother, and she'd somehow forgotten her keys or something. I got up and started to go to the kitchen, when out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the key hook near the door. The keys were not there. To some people, that may not be a big deal, but to me, that meant for sure the person knocking on my door at night was in fact not my mother. My mom was a bit of a routine-obsessed person, so if she'd actually forgotten something, they'd be right where she left them. I took a deep breath, preparing myself to just not answer the door, or if they didn't leave, to tell them I wasn't interested and to go away right now. Thinking back on it, I really wish I hadn't even looked out the window on the door. I wish I just sat back down, called my mom, and stayed out of sight. Of course, I walked in front of the door, and immediately came face to face with a figure on the other side of the window. Now, it was really dark, mind you, with just my neighbor's light shining from his porch. I could only make out a couple of things about this guy because of this. He was tall. I had to peer up at him through the window to even glance at his face. He had extremely long hair that looked like a shadow over his shoulders in the dim light. The only facial features I could make through his messy hair were his eyes. I wish I hadn't seen them. I could see the spark of interest flare up in them as he perked up when he saw who I was. They grew creepily wide, and he began to stare down at me. He took a step towards my door. I heard him say something along the lines of, "My car broke down nearby. Can I come in and use your phone?" Immediately, I thought of every bad thing I'd ever heard happening to a teenager home alone and tried to compose my nerves. I can't put my finger on exactly what it was, but something was telling me not to let this man standing on the other side of my door do anything. I shouted back a quick no and an apology. I hoped he was telling the truth and would simply go to the next house over. He didn't, though. He simply said the exact same thing again, quite a bit louder now. I thought for a quick moment he hadn't heard me. Now I know better, though. I answered back a little more confidently. "I'm sorry, I can't help you. Go to the next house. For a moment he paused, as if contemplating what to do. He stared me right in the eyes, and then began to knock again, slowly getting louder than the first time I'd heard it. My heart rate increased as I stared back at him. When I didn't react, he started to loudly slam against the door. I took a step back, praying to whatever god I could he would either leave or my mom would get home early. I was usually a quiet girl. My mom was a redneck with a raptor knife though, so maybe she could take him. He started to bang on the glass after a moment. My mind was racing 1,000 miles an hour. What should I do? Run? My phone was in another room, but I was scared to take my eyes off this man. I was sure he would break the glass immediately as soon as I did so. The banging was vibrating my eardrums, and apparently it had woken Maury up too. I saw him creeping up past the doorway, teeth bared. He started to growl loudly. The man stopped for a moment, trying to see into the window at the floor where Maury stood. When he stopped barking for a moment, the man tried to force the door handle. That's when Vince went crazy. I swear to God, for a dog that was dead asleep not even 5 seconds prior, I'd never seen him move that fast ever. In only 2 seconds, Vince had his paws up against the door, growling like a hellhound at this man outside my home. The man was very clearly startled. He fell back on his ass and bolted away. I heard him say something as he started to run and saw another shadow move from outside my view. My mom came home shortly after I sprinted across my carport to my neighbor's. We called the police after I explained what happened, and my neighbor grabbed his shotgun out before they even got there. He insisted on looking for the guy himself. I had to stop him even. And the police said someone had tried to pick the lock on my front door too, but there was a lot of stuff in front of it and it was really old, so it didn't open anymore. I went to bed that night uneasy and very grateful I had 2 dogs who were not only strong and big, but were vigilant and would practically kill for me if I would have let them. A few weeks went by and we hadn't heard anything from the cops, so eventually I stopped trying to think about it. Another month went by, and although I was still a bit scared of being home alone, nothing else seemed to happen. Then we got another visit from the cops. What they told me made my heart sink in my chest, and still gives me chills to this day. They had caught the guys, and it turned out they had been stalking me. And yes, guys plural. There were 2 that had been apparently stalking me everywhere, without my knowledge for months. They had several photos of me, with words they had written over them. The police had been fairly adamant I change my locks. They'd caught the 2 guys from that incident, but there was evidence of a 3rd man being involved as well. We moved shortly thereafter, needless to say. I still pass by that house sometimes. When I go to visit friends or do stuff around that area, a chill runs down my spine every time. To think they never caught one of the guys was scary enough. The fact they tried to break into my house was worse. But the worst thing was that I hadn't even known they were fully watching me. I still think about it now, even a few more years later. I dread what would have happened if my dogs hadn't been there. And I dread even worse about what they planned to do if I just opened the door or they had successfully broken in. I suppose they weren't expecting my dogs, since our backyard is fenced and they mostly stayed indoors. I thank the universe every day I had them with me. My mom never worked until after dark again after that, which in all honesty was just fine with me. I used to work at a small neighborhood gas station. I was working an opening shift at 6 a.m. with my best friend / coworker. We were doing our normal opening things. As the sun came up, I went to get some ice from out the back. For reference, the gas station building used to have a drive-thru, so we had that kind of drive-thru window back there as well. I happened to glance at the back window before going out, only to do a double take when I realized there was a literal bloody handprint on that window. I looked closer. There were smudges of blood around the window handle. It looked like someone had definitely been attempting to force it open. We were both really freaked out now, needless to say. We went to look around the other potential entrances of the building. I looked at the window in front and noticed dried blood on the hole where we take money for gas from outside. Someone had been trying to stick their hand in to get something inside for some reason. I kept on looking around further. Dried blood on the front door handles. Splatters of blood on the glass like someone had been pounding on it. My friend and I were both freaking out at this point. Luckily, I had access to the security cameras. I checked on them for any motion detected during the night. At around 5 a.m., there was a motion capture. We watched as a man with his entire body covered in blood walked around the store trying to find a way to get in. The freakiest thing was, usually the store opened at 5 a.m., but this just so happened to be Sunday, and we opened at 6 instead. Really dodged a bullet there. There were police lights in the distance on the cameras, so we called the sheriff to see what was going on. He showed up pretty quick, watched the security footage, and confirmed it was a guy they'd picked up just a bit after 5:30, just before we got there. That was the craziest thing that happened to me in my 3.5 years of working at gas stations. My name is Leia. I live in the north of France in one of the houses in a family neighborhood. I was 15 years old when this story happened. My parents were separating. My mother was a nurse, so I was often left at home alone. It was November of 2021, I believe. It would get much darker much earlier around that time, so that meant I was home alone in absolute darkness. Around 7 p.m., I heard some knocking at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone to come by though. I was paralyzed in surprise. A few minutes later, the knocking repeated. I looked in the peephole of my door, but I couldn't see anyone there. I thought it must be a prank by children in my neighborhood or something. The knocking stopped just a few moments later, and nothing else happened for 4 more days. It was a Saturday this time. I had invited 2 of my girlfriends to my house, Luis and Satine. That day, my mother was at work. We were watching a movie in my living room when I went to pick up my charger in my room. My 2 friends were alone downstairs when they heard those same knocks as the night before. Their first thought was that my mother was coming home early. They didn't know about that previous incident. They opened the door, only to see no one was there once more. The 3 of us were confused. We didn't know what was going on. Luis reassured us though, telling us surely we were creating this stress in our heads. Maybe it was just a coincidence with that knocking from last night. The rest of the evening went over quite well, and nobody knocked for the rest of that night. That's what I told myself at least, until next Wednesday night. I'd just come back home from the grocery store after buying some pasta. After eating, I went back to my room to finish my homework with my headphones in. I was listening to some music. Suddenly, I began to hear banging against the walls. Naturally, at first, I thought this was my rabbit, getting angry and thumping because he was hungry. After a few blows, though, I could hear things moving around on their own. I took courage with both hands and decided to bravely go down to the living room. In the reflection of the mirror in the hallway, I saw the silhouette of a man tapping on my window with a crowbar. I was petrified. The man still hadn't seen me. He then came to knock on the door, the exact same patterns as the other 2 times with his crowbar. Still grasping all my courage best I could, I grabbed a knife. I quietly walked over to the front door. The man was tapping with his crowbar louder and louder. I shouted through the door, telling him to get fucked, and that I was already on the phone with the police. As soon as he heard that, he ran away, and he didn't come back after. As soon as he left, I really did call the police. I was bluffing when he ran away. After hanging up, I cried. I thought that would have been the last moments of my life. He looked like he was about to try and break the window in. 10 minutes later, a patrol arrived, but they couldn't do anything except patrol regularly around my home. The man was never caught or arrested. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't heard the noises that day. This was the moment when I was most scared in my entire life, and it changed everything for me. Let me start by saying this is something I've had to go through, and there are still some things about it I don't really understand. I don't talk about this to anyone in my personal life, really. Not because of how painful it is, mind you, but I just don't like people's reactions to it. No matter how well-intentioned the other person is, it tends to alter relationships permanently. And though over the past 21 years, I've learned to talk about what really happened, I'll tell it from my perspective from back then, the way I remember it. I lived with my mom at the time. My parents had been divorced for 3 years, which for a 7-year-old is pretty much your entire life. My mom back then was someone who took extra care with me. She didn't like it when I played in the yard. She didn't like it when I spent a lot of time at our neighbor's house, always personally dropped me off at school, and was waiting for me at the end of the day to take me home. She taught me to lock all 3 locks on our door, and how to see what different cars were parked outside, and which ones were familiar. Of course, stranger danger. She was, I now understand, paranoid. There's lots more things, but I'll just skip all that. One night, we were sitting on the couch watching TV when a small pickup truck pulled into our driveway. This was really strange. We weren't expecting anyone. Even worse, though, was my mom's reaction. I'd never seen her move so fast. She leapt up from the couch to make sure the door was locked. Then she ran to me, picked me up hard, and carried me to her bedroom and back. She told me to hide underneath the bed. She ran out of the room and closed the door behind her. I heard a man pounding on the front door. Then she started yelling and screaming at him. All of a sudden there was a giant crash. Moments later, the bedroom door flew open and my mom ran inside. There was a big man behind her. I could see the cuffs of his jeans and the toes of his black and brown shoes. My mom was screaming. She tried to turn around and slam the bedroom door shut, but suddenly it pushed open and she was thrown onto the bed right above me. The heels of her bare feet were by my head, hovering just a few inches off the floor, and the man's shoes were in the doorway. There was complete silence for a moment before my mom started to quaver audibly. I heard 2 really loud pops, and nothing moved. The man's feet ran away. I heard his truck start and pull out of the driveway. I waited for my mom to come and get me. Her feet slid down to touch the floor, and the rest of her did too. Her hair was all messy and frizzy. She had her back turned to me, curled with her knees against her chest, and her nightshirt was up in her armpits. I put my hand on her back and was about to ask her if she was okay, when I saw a pool of liquid coming toward me from under her body. I flew away from her, out from under the bed and onto the other side of the room. I was probably screaming at her or something. It seemed like just a few seconds had passed, pressed hard against the wall as I could with my face buried against the baseboard, before I began to hear sirens. It was a big city, so I was used to that noise, but it got louder and louder. Now more feet ran through the front door and into my house. I thought the man had come back. I heard people yelling police, and thought that's what I needed. I needed the police right now. The rest of the night, feet stomping, blankets wrapped around me, I was whisked past my mom so I couldn't see her. I remember really wanting to tell them to help her, but I couldn't find a way to get the words out. It took a long time for me to forgive myself for that. Of course, they were going to help her. They put her into an ambulance while I stood on the front lawn and watched. I followed in a police car behind. Never really got the chance to see her again. They said she died in the ambulance. I saw her at the funeral, of course, but that wasn't really her. The questions answered later don't really help that much, but here they are. My dad had cheated on my mom, and my mom cheated on my dad in revenge. The guy she was with decided to leave his own wife for my mom. My dad left because everything was so messed up. My mom felt really guilty and broke it off with the guy. He was very upset with how she'd ruined his life. She had been worried about him for years after. He found her through a mutual friend, and that was that. The man went back to his apartment after and killed himself too. There was a lot of time with the police. I talked to a lady in a room in front of a camera. My dad came and took me to his house to live with him. It was an extremely confusing time. I realized in that moment there are two English languages, one that kids speak and one that adults speak, and only adults are fluent in both. They would have conversations with me in that foreign tongue, going above my head, then switch to child language and say, "Now tell us what you saw. You're going to live with me now," and stuff like that. That's my scary story. My dad really wasn't all that into kids. I just kinda pulled inside myself and worked on school. I went to college, have a good job, have good friends, all of that. But I've learned not to speak about this. The internet is great for anonymously talking about things. But I'm not sure if this really helps anyone. It's just a sad and scary story. I've spent most of my life only talking about this to therapists. And despite what you might think of seeing it on TV, it's actually really helpful. I remember every moment of that night, every breath, every footstep, every loud noise and whimper, and I always will. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in the comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.